I know it's the end of a work day for all of you to be able to give your time, but it's a great training to be part of. So to introduce myself, my name is Kala Chakradhar. I teach at a university here in the US and in a social work program. I'm also a clinician, so I work on practice too, part-time. So I got involved with INDEAR, which is now MAP INDEAR, in the last few months when a few South Asian mental health professionals and other non-South Asian professionals also got together to be able to respond to the COVID situation, especially for mental health professionals, doctors who are on the front lines and have been facing stress in relation to people's responses, people's expectations, and which a lot of times escalates into violence of different kinds. And so it really tests people's resilience, and also because we as professionals are also experiencing our own stress in relation to COVID. And so to also be able to help others but not get the recognition or the response we expect can be very demanding. So this series of trainings were mainly in response to that, to be able to support professionals in different ways, including doctors and other mental health professionals, to be able to understand how to de-escalate, how to understand this violence, and be able to respond in more healthy ways, both for others and for ourselves. Okay, so I would like to now introduce Ms. Deborah Horowitz, who is a clinician, a social worker, and her background is where she has a master's in social work. She's licensed for clinical practice. She has more than 25 years of experience in the field. She's not only a clinician, but also has rich research experience and also in training and education, mainly in the healthcare field. So her credentials also include expertise in different forms of therapy. And so she's part of the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, where she's offered and continues to offer a number of trainings across the state. As you know, Massachusetts is the northeastern state. And so her research includes a lot of work in relation to safety, healing, and also trauma-informed approaches to addressing violence in different forms. And she's also developed a lot of training materials, curricula to train others, and also as part of her preparation for training. And important is also that she is known for her leadership skills and team building, working with multiple groups, not only in mental health, but within the community. So she has been recognized for that, number of awards, one of them being the Partners in Excellence Award for Teamwork. So she's also been invited because of her background and skills and expertise as a speaker at a number of conferences and within various communities as well. So I'm glad to have been associated with Ms. Horowitz, and I'm sure you will enjoy what she has to offer today. Today's training is session 2, which focuses on behavior. All behavior is meaningful behavior, where trauma, violence, and its impact on brain development. And so you will look into the neurobiology, attachment styles, feeling states, and also the role of cognition, thinking in relation to that. She'll also present the 3-tier model for identifying the hot zones for violent behavior. And she'll also share her experiences as she shares these details in relation to violence. So over to you, Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kala. I really appreciate your introducing and moderating. I also want to mention that Nancy Sweeney is here as well with us in the room, because some of the things that we talk about may be activating for people. They may bring up feelings, and we are in the midst of a COVID crisis, and people are already stretched very thin. And so if somebody needs to talk separately or needs additional support, Nancy is here to provide that. And I hope people will take advantage of it if needed. I'm very grateful and happy to be here today and to share with you the things that I have come to know over the years. And I invite you to critically think with me, to share your wisdom, to share your experiences, because very often that's when the most amazing solutions come up, is when people are thinking together about ideas. And so I'm hoping that when we talk about behavior, we begin to take a new look at that and what it means and how we understand it in context. So I'm
Deborah,
going to.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Thanks for introducing Nancy also. And before you begin, I missed talking about the way people would interact,
Sure,
the use of chat. So to everyone here, I would like you to introduce yourselves on the chat so we know who you are, what is your background. And as Ms. Deborah proceeds with her presentation, please feel free to add your comments, questions in the chat box, and we will look it up and respond to it as we go. Okay. Sorry, Deborah. Thank you.
Oh, that's quite all right. And Nancy, do you want to add anything before we get going?
Just that I'm here and I'm available. And if people want to contact me privately through the chat message, I would be happy to respond. Thanks, Deborah.
You're welcome. All right, let's begin. To share my screen with you. All right, so as we were mentioning, today is session 2. We will be building on many of the concepts that we talked about in session 1. In session 1, we talked about the nature of violence, the mechanisms it takes, and how it interacts and impacts both an individual and a culture at large. So today we're going to break down some of the things around behavior and see what is going on neurobiologically that leads to some escalations. Because behavior is more than meets the eye. So I don't know if anybody told you in your training that you are actually going to have to be code breakers in addition to therapists, that there are drivers and influences acting on people. And so I want to start out with sort of asking people to put in the chat, what are some of the scenarios, the factors and experiences that patients and their families bring to us even before we meet them? So what do you think is going on for these individual patients and families before you ever see them? So just put that in the chat. I'll give you a minute. People typing. Okay. So let me give you an example. If you have somebody who has recently lost their job, that is going to impact their behavior and the way they relate to you before they even get to you. So we have to understand how all of these behaviors and the meanings people make of them come to us. And these very same drivers that are acting on our patients and families are acting on us. I've been through traditional training, which has often said, check yourself at the door, leave yourself outside. And actually, that's really not the way to go. You're going to bring yourself wherever you go. It's what you're going to do with that information once you have it. So when we're even talking about transference or countertransference, how we feel about a particular person or patient and how they respond to us, those drivers are active. And so that level of self-awareness, that feeling state that we have, we can use as barometers of where we need to go. So attachment styles have quite a bit to do with the way in which we see the world. I will, after this session, I'm going to send out, and I also had an individual email me, the resources with the video links for this particular piece. But we'll just talk about it at the moment. Childhood has a huge impact on the lens we use to see the world. People who have cognitive flexibility will use all of these styles. They will please sometimes. They will feel blamed. They may go back and forth and feel ambivalent. They may try to insert control, or they may even want to avoid a situation altogether. Those that have the cognitive flexibility are those that can determine when those are needed. Unfortunately, sometimes people get really stuck. They get really stuck in one kind of way of relating to the world. And so they relate to the world the same way, regardless. And that's when it becomes challenging. That's when it becomes entrenched and can get to be problematic. So from our very earliest days, we are primed for temperament and attachment. And these levels of attachment have everything to do with how we proceed forward. And it isn't that any one of these is more right or wrong than the other. These are across the continuum. It's that level of stuckness that sometimes we feel and we see. And when we are more under stress, the style that we tend to default to is the style that you were first primed with. So I'll give you an example. My mother was always busy, working constantly. I rarely saw her. I spent a lot of time on my own. And so when there is a situation that comes up, I tend to default, come up with a solution on my own. Well, that may work sometimes, but what if it involves a team who really needs to know what I'm thinking? And so that's why understanding where we come from and what our default is has everything to do, because if I'm going off as the sort of lone wolf and the rest of the team is over here, that's going to cause a conflict. And so that's what I invited you to think about. And when I send the video link and you watch it, I think people most can identify with a little bit of each in ourselves, because again, this is a very human condition. As is our brain. Our reptilian brain, which is the part of our brain that is right back here, that is responsible for the automatic systems in our body, our breathing, our heart rate, okay? And the limbic system, which is on top of that, which deals with emotions, are the oldest parts of the brain. These have wired together because they have fired together over and over and over again. It is an evolutionary adaptation that it happens. The newer part of the brain is the neocortex. That's the part where speech and logic and judgment and insight and the ability to abstract all come from. But it is the reptilian and limbic system that still has the power to override that neocortex. And that is what is happening when we perceive a threat, either real or imagined. Your body will never say to you that there is no threat when there is one. It may tell you that there's a threat when there isn't one, because that's post-traumatic stress. But your body will never tell you that there is no threat when there is an actual threat to you. And so we have to honor that part of ourselves and examine it and allow for it to come to the surface when we need it, to then get our neocortex back online and say, hey, what am I going to do with this? And that's where we do that in this escalation cycle. Fear is the part of the reptilian brain. That's that fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode, right? It is fundamental. It is hardwired. It is automatic. And yet, many of us as healthcare providers frequently try to talk ourselves out of that feeling, right? We spend a lot of time doubting what our body is telling us, our gut instinct. And what happens here is that people who are afraid will send out messages of don't mess with me. So you're going to get a very angry presentation with somebody who is very, very fearful inside. And that's where those escalations that lead to violence happen, is because the person is so afraid of losing something fundamentally important to them. And here in COVID, it's literally their lives or their livelihoods or their children or food or a whole host of even basic needs. And so the more losses, the more cumulative effect, the more fear, the more anger we're going to see. There we go. And we talked about in the first session that being in this prolonged state has unbelievable consequences for our body long term. It's exhausting. So healthcare workers who in the course of their job are already tired are spent, absolutely spent. And many are not sleeping or eating correctly. Many have gotten ill, not just with COVID, but with general heart issues, cholesterol issues, because of the prolonged stress. This was supposed to be, your fight, flight, freeze, or appease was supposed to be very short term. It was supposed to get you out of the immediate danger and then settle down. But what has happened is it's like we put our foot on the gas and it keeps going and there is no respite. And so what happens then is our bodies begin to stop telling us that there's a threat. It shuts down. It's like many of you who have ever been through a fire drill, if anybody ever had a fire drill in the building, and after like the 7th or 8th one, people are going, it's just a drill, and they don't evacuate the building. This is just like that. Your body has told you there's a threat, there's a threat, but there's no relief in sight. You forget to pay attention to the alarms. And that causes us to underperceive or overperceive situations that could be potentially dangerous. And we know that there is evidence that diminished growth in the left hemisphere, because you are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and that part is not developing as quickly or directly as possible, leads to the risk of depression. Constant irritability in that limbic system being activated can lead to panic disorder and other kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder. We have smaller growth in the hippocampus, where many of our memories are situated. As I was saying in the first session, if you're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, you're not encoding any other information not directly related to your survival. If you are under threat and you're trying to get through a college course about historical whatever, that's not coming. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is taking care of ourselves from the most basic centers up. Oftentimes we want to talk about talk therapy, and talk therapy is incredibly invaluable. But talk therapy goes from the top down when what's driving the show is bottom up. And so we'll spend some more time talking about that. Okay. All right. Here you can actually see a brain scan of what happens to a brain when there is extreme neglect. So the one on the left is a 3-year-old that has had normal connection, normal social bonding, attachment is solid. And the other one is a brain where there may have been an anxious avoidant attachment, or failure to thrive altogether. And so you can literally see the physiological differences. So what we have to understand is we cannot expect that both of these brains operate the same way. And so oftentimes we take what is happening as incredibly personal to us. When people are yelling at you and swearing at you and screaming at you, we take that in. This allows us to say, wow, there is something going on in that brain that has nothing to do with me personally. Let me calm my own system so then I can address that. And that's a very empowering place for staff to be, to not feel in that moment without a means to de-escalate or get away from the situation. And to recognize that there are many more factors involved in that than anything you have done or said. I often hear a lot of providers saying, I don't know what I did. What did I do wrong? How come it didn't? Oftentimes it has nothing to do with you, other than they were activated by a whole host of factors and you happen to be there. And unfortunately, we are seeing that with the mob violence. We'll talk much more about that. But I want us to remember that the brains of people who have experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of violence are fundamentally different. Now, does that mean that they will never heal? No. What it means is that they will need different kinds of supports in order to heal, in order to wire the brain. And luckily, we now have research that says, okay, the adult brain now doesn't fully form until they're about 25. I'm going to go one further. The adult brain doesn't stop forming and changing until you're dead. It is a continuous, ongoing process. And with the right supports and the right combination of services, people can go on to live full, rich, meaningful lives without needing to have that part of the brain driving the show. And because most violence occurs in the context of relationships, the healing must take place within the same context. Does that mean that you have to stay in a relationship where you've been hurt? Absolutely not. What it means is that in order for you to heal, you have to have a different kind of relationship, perhaps with someone else entirely, that feels corrective and emotionally supportive. That's why therapy is so useful. It is that concept of transference to you, right? That person is relating to you as they related to their mother or father or anyone else, and having a corrective experience. That is what we're talking about, is that the context of a relationship, regardless of whom it's with after the event, is what is healing. And I want us all to remember too, that communication is incredibly complex, okay? Every time there is a conversation between two people, right? There are many, many levels of communication happening within that conversation, okay? So what is happening in a conversation, if I were to say, hey, Nancy, how you doing this morning? You look lovely. And Nancy were to say to me, thank you so much. You know, I got up and I was really excited to be here. That's what you're hearing on the surface. Well, what's going on behind the scenes is what I'm thinking about myself in that conversation. What Nancy is thinking about herself in that conversation. The judgment I'm making about Nancy, oh, you look lovely today. And the judgment Nancy is making about me, that's a sincere compliment. I'm going to respond. And then it is about my judgment of her judgment of me and her judgment of my judgment of her. There are 6 levels of communication operating. So when you're having an escalation, if that person is in the fight, flight, or freeze, it's always about me, and you're in the I'm judging them about what they've just said, you've already missed the opportunity. So it's understanding that even within simple dynamics, you have to meet the person where they are. And that often means suspending your own judgment and paying attention to the fundamentals. to make this even more complex, there are your own family of origin issues coming into this. And then your cultural affiliation issues. And then the last issue is whomever that person had the last conversation with before they got to you. So Walt Disney actually had it right. Walt Disney said that for every single negative interaction, it takes 7 positive ones to correct it. Is it any wonder that our healthcare providers are exhausted? That's what is important here, is understanding all of these factors that are at play when you're in that moment. And it takes practice, and it's a skill, and it's not a skill that we tend to teach very well. And so it requires a different kind of learning for people. And hopefully this will be the foundation for that. Because, and I'm just putting these up. So when we're having a therapeutic relationship, and by the way, therapeutic relationships are so much more than simply helpful. A helpful relationship is when somebody delivers your mail or takes away the trash. That's helpful, but that's not necessarily therapeutic. A therapeutic interaction engages with that person, that there's a reason for that interaction, that it has beneficial effects for that individual beyond just the immediate. And it takes into account what the context is. We are such complex people that you are likely to be closer to your partner, your spouse, than you are to your mail carrier. That's appropriate. However, if you're treating everybody the way you treat your spouse, that becomes a bit of a difficulty, right? Because there are boundaries, there are paradigms, and those are there to protect us in many, many ways. So we're not doing any more harm. And in fact, we want to avoid stepping on people's shame buttons, right? Because we were talking in the first one about shame, humiliation, rejection, and ridicule as being huge drivers in escalations. And so therapeutic relationships avoid re-traumatizing the individual. And if it happens, actively seek to correct it. That's a whole different ballgame. And healthcare workers, regardless of whether you work in mental health or physical health or some other health allied situation, see this all the time because you are in a public service sector profession. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to understand that there is a power differential between the patients and the families and us. By design, there's a hierarchy. There are also those structural mechanisms and cultural belief systems about what we believe our healthcare providers can and can't do, which we will touch base on. But it becomes incumbent upon us to take a great more care in our interactions, meaning that we're not exploiting or coercing or intimidating our patients and families. And we're on the lookout for the signs that they are feeling that that is the case. I've read a number of studies now in India about people who feel that the billing is not accurate or transparent and there's no redress for them. Well, we need to be aware of that, and so that we sit down and spend more time so that they're not feeling pressured to pay something that they don't have, or that we're addressing those feelings around unfairness and relatedness that we talked about in the SCARF model in the first session. And that we're aware of all of these components in our communication. It's really important when we have that power differential that is spent as we are, we don't set or say things in a dismissive tone. It's difficult. We are challenged with that. But when we do that, when we give people a hand signal, like, or we ignore what they're saying, or we say something sort of abrupt and curt, that adds and compounds to the stress for that individual, because now they think that you are also devaluing their concerns on top of them having those concerns. And so we don't want to view the individual or patient as less than or as like body parts, right? We're not looking, a good physician will treat the illness. A great physician will treat the person with the illness. That's what we're looking at, is this holistic, we're not treating adults as children. So we have to watch our tones. Are we being patronizing? Are we being dismissive? Do we treat them like the help that many of us may have? Because those are the things that we have control over that can make the difference about whether that interaction goes smoothly or not. And ultimately, we want people to have the skills and the tools to not need us in the same way. Does that mean that we are going to go out of business? Heck no. We're going to stay in business. What it does mean is that as people heal, we'll be more independent from that individual, and then we'll be going to some other individual. And so all of these things, of course, require time, which I understand people do not feel they ever have enough of. 24 hours in a day doesn't feel like enough with the things that we're doing. And so what I want people to remember is it's not the quantity of time you spend, it is the quality of time you spend. You can diffuse a situation in under 5 minutes, whereas a full-on escalation that results in a mob action is hours and hours and hours. It takes patience. It does. It takes patience and practice and focused attention, and it requires a level of respect. And respect in Latin means to look back and or to look again. So it means taking a deeper look, to going back to what we thought we knew about this person and maybe we didn't. It requires empathy, which can save your life. I kid you not, I'm going to show you how that works. Empathy can save your life. And compassion is the best thing, and perhaps one of the few things that actively physiologically shuts down that fear response. And here we have it. What is going on with you individually has larger ramifications to the society at large and globally now. We are now a global civilization. And so what is going on with you has ramifications, and additionally, what is going on globally and culturally and in your city and in your town has implications for you. This can be unbelievably empowering if we recognize that each interaction that goes well is another step towards a larger systemic change. Sometimes if we think about the whole, it can seem a bit overwhelming and daunting, when really it is just going to take those little interactions one by one by one by one to make the bigger change. And that's what I want us to remember, that you do have right within your grasp the ability to understand and make a difference. In a dynamic of two people, only one person has to change the way they behave to change the outcome. It can be you. So empathy is a skill that can be developed. I was once in a training course where the trainer said, empathy, you either have it or you don't. And I went, oh, because it can be learned. Not only can it be learned, it can be reinvigorated, right? But it means that we have to be willing to do it. It means we have to look in the mirror, which is often uncomfortable for us, right? And figure out what our lens is, what we're feeling, how we're acting, and take a look at that. It means we have to listen differently than we have been doing in the past. For many of us who have been sort of classically trained, this is hard, right? Because classically trained, we are the ones who ask question after question after question, right? Why? This, when somebody is escalating, asking why makes it worse. Asking how or what makes it better. Asking and listening for asking open-ended questions. And the 3 best words I will tell you are tell me more. Tell me more about that. It differs from sympathy, which I'm going to show you a video in a moment, because we do have to teach the difference between sympathy and empathy. And it requires us to be vulnerable, to be in touch with our own feeling state. So that notion again of check yourself at the door, no, you need to bring it in the door. You've got to take a look at it. So I'm going to show you the video at the moment, and I'm going to stop and pause if anybody has any questions or put anything in the chat while I call the video up. Please, we'll take a minute and address that. Therapy. Yes, we can. You can constantly learn and grow. Exactly. So we do have to talk, and we will talk about those compensatory expectations, because absolutely there are ways in which we need to interact and maintain set of boundaries, but also clarify what the expectations are in the relationship. Am I in here? Okay.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had a, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversation is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. Thoughts about that? What's going on with the difference between sympathy and empathy? When do we usually use sympathy? Absolutely. You can feel helpless when you can't cheer them up. You bet. What else? Where do we usually use sympathy? Oftentimes
More
it's,
where we are trying
go
to
ahead,
feel
co-op.
I think it's more where we are trying to make feel sorry for the person, rather than trying to relate to how they must be feeling.
Absolutely, absolutely. It says there's this element of pity. It says, I'm so sorry for you, but underneath that is, oh, I'm so glad it's not me. And that is this disconnection. So having that empathic response is the understanding that that could be me. Given the right set of circumstances, that could be me. And so we all in our own lives have experiences that have been painful, where we've suffered, where there's been loss. And we can use the feeling state to connect with other people. So I'm going to give you a personal example. I was 17 years old. I am in a white Pontiac Grand Am. I am the passenger in this car. My boyfriend at the time was carrying a hot meal in the back seat, and a boy who was trying to impress me was driving. And we were going down this long, windy road and speeding. And I said to him, slow down, and he didn't. And I put my seatbelt on, and less than 10 seconds later, we skidded into a tree at 63 miles an hour. I broke everything on my right side. My kidneys were bleeding, my spleen ruptured, I needed a blood transfusion, my lungs collapsed. When do you think I learned to drive? Because every time I saw a white Pontiac Grand Am, whoosh, came right back. Every time we stopped short in a car, whoosh, it came right back. That intense loss of control, that intense fear response, I can use that to understand another person's experience. Now, you don't have to share, and personally, for therapeutic purposes, not sharing the details of that, but using that understanding that you have to connect with another person. So sympathy is also, what if it was me, but it's what if it was me, and oh, I hope it's not me. And empathy is, that could be me, and how would I want to be responded to if that were me? And so we really do have to begin to differentiate and teach about these things. And that's not often in our academic curriculum, right? These are skills that we build along the way, but are so incredibly vital. Absolutely, joining with them, using that suffering means that it's a we, not a you and an I. It's not an adversarial relationship. It's not I'm better than you when you're less than I am. It's that we can look at the problem rather than fighting at the people. Okay. Other thoughts about that? Did you like the video? All right. So we have to talk now about compassion. We've talked about empathy, and empathy is that antidote for anger. Right? And we'll review that again. But to overcome fear, that fight, flight, freeze, or appease response requires us to get in touch with compassion. Compassion is the genuine desire to help another person. People know when we are being disingenuous. People know when that they are not really being cared for. They understand and can smell when we are not authentically ourselves. And if the brain codes uncertainty, and all ambiguity as threat, then if you are disingenuous or they feel patronized, you are being coded as a threat. and their brain is telling them that you are the threat. Therefore, by having this stance of compassion, you make yourself less of a target. This is actually a skill that you need so that you can go home in one piece. And that is where we're headed to talk about this a little bit more. So if we look at compassion, it's actually very remarkable. It does differ from empathy. Empathy is that perspective taking of another person. Compassion is that sincere desire to help. And we do, evolutionarily speaking, have the need to bond, right? Social bonding is helpful for the survival of our species. We also know from our work that connection makes people more resilient to stress. When we feel compassion, and that is shutting off the physiological fear response, then we're not dumping the adrenaline and the cortisol that is making for the diabetes or the heart disease down the road. We're actually strengthening our immune response. We're becoming stronger. It also allows us to see beyond black and white. We can see shades of gray. When we feel compassion and a desire to help, we feel less resentful, less vindictive. There's less blame. And blame is a huge part of the shame component. And there's a saying, praise and blame are all the same, because they're both about judgment, right? So this compassionate stance has physiological benefits. You can see it on a PET scan. You can see the heart rate slowing. You can see the release of oxytocin, which bonds us, which tells us we're in love, which brings us closer to people. So we as people who are in this stance feel better ourselves. We feel more energized. We feel happier. We engage more with others. It strengthens our desire to be in the field rather than inhibiting it. And so we become much more aware of the surroundings and people and much more socially adept. This skill is the foundation for safety. So we have to find a way for each and every one of us to get to this place. And I dare say that when people entered this field, they came into the field with this desire to help, right? You got into this because there was an expectation to help or a desire to help. And that was just starting your journey. Well, that has to come back into our journey, because over time we do get tired. And there is eustress, which is positive stress in our lives, right? These are the happy events. Oh, I'm gonna, have the weekend off, or I get to spend time with my children and I'm excited about that. And that increases and replenishes us. And then there are the other stressors that are negative. And so because we are faced with so many more negative stressors, we have to be much more mindful of how our compassion bucket is filled. And this need for social bonding, this need to be connected to others, is on the same neural pathway as the drive for food and sex. So if we look at brain development, the cells from stem cells through their identity in the brain, through the way that they wire together, that all shows up in how we ultimately behave. Nature and nurture together in how we behave. And so this social bonding is vital for how we interact and survive with each other. So we were talking last time as violence is an infectious disease, but so is positivity and compassion. And when we replace them, we can do great things one at a time. So Paul Ekman actually came up and did some research around, yes, there's a taxonomy of compassion. Who would have thunk? Here we are. But it starts out with the most basic of, we kind of understand what somebody else is feeling, basic empathy. And it goes all the way up until we arrive at heroic compassion. Heroic compassion has two parts. Immediate, which is there's a crisis and first responders and police and firefighters grab their gear and just go. That's immediate heroic compassion. And then there's considered heroic compassion. That's people who know that what they do could be dangerous, are doing it with few resources, may not have enough connection, could understand they could be hurt, and they know that ahead of time and they go anyway. That is all of you. That is all of the healthcare workers who understand the risks and take them on and go. And if you are at the highest level of compassion, you need the most to replenish yourself, not the least, the most, because it takes that much energy. If you were in some other kind of field that dealt with widgets or other kinds of commodities and not people, you might not necessarily need to focus so much on the compassion and replenishment for yourself. But here, it's vital. And so what I will often tell my students is that taking care of oneself, replenishing oneself, doing enough self-care is not an option. It's an ethical obligation because you cannot serve from an empty vessel. And so those things that you used to try and squeeze in here or there that maybe were good for you have to become a priority. Because if you don't have compassion, when you are confronted with somebody who has a global fear response and you're depleted, you are a target. And there may be very little at that point that you can see to do about it. So we have to build this in. We have to build this in, not as an add-on to our lives, like one more thing I have to do, but as fundamental to our humanness. So I will ask my staff and I will ask my friends, and I'm going to ask each and every one of you to put it in the chat box. What is it that you do for fun? What do you do for fun?
Deborah, if I can jump in while people are thinking about what they do for fun. As you've been describing this last part of it, I've been thinking how absolutely critical this is, because I think there may be others like me who went into the profession because I wanted to help people, but also felt that the role was respected. And that was an important part of it. And I think when you're facing the pandemic, and due to a lack of resources and a lack of systemic support, that part of it is missing when people are working so very hard and not getting the respect they deserve. I think that makes it even harder.
I would agree with that, Nancy. Absolutely. And so what makes it that so prominent is the need then to find those nuggets of connection that do validate us, and those tasks where we have a beginning and a middle and an end. And
Yes.
We then feel a sense of accomplishment and pride because we're not getting recognized in the field that we do. We're not getting compensated. Nobody is extremely wealthy doing this work. And so the things that validate us are those things that we have mastery over in other areas of our lives when we may not feel like we have any control here. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, and hopefully colleagues we can connect with who understand what it's like.
And making that available and also sort of normalizing it, right? Yes, we're doing to help people, but we also are people.
Yes.
With those same needs. So let's see, what are people saying about?
Some wonderful comments on self-care. Would you like to read it or should I?
Okay, let's see. Artwork, oh, fantastic. Arts and crafts, meditation, sipping a hot cup of coffee and a nice massage. I had a massage yesterday. That was phenomenal because oftentimes we don't even realize how tense we are until we're not. So I'm so glad to see that. Socializing, talking with people, absolutely. Music, beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Preeti said dance. Mm-hmm.
Dancing, fantastic. Things that bring joy, bring a sense of purpose, bring a sense of meaning are very, very, very important here. And so I oftentimes when I am talking with people who are not in the field, right, they're like, wow, I didn't know how difficult or challenging it was. And so there's also this lack of acknowledgement from larger structures, not just related to healthcare. Right. And so when we need to fill up our tank, right, we have to look for commonalities. We need to find people, places, and things that have similar interests. Okay. I will say it is also vitally important to have friends both in the field and not in the field. Because if all your friends are in the field, when you get together, you're going to talk about the field. Right? So also ways that you calm your inner warrior, right? We all do that reinforcement of how did my day go? What do I have to do next? Where am I going to go? What's left for me to do? Did I do that right? We need to be able to let that go. So one of the things is to learn how to leave the work at work and home at home. And to develop a ritual that places a marker where one ends and one begins. This is very, very difficult now with Zoom and emails in the middle of the night, right? Or your pager is going off if people still have them, or texting, or working from home with extended hours. But we have to find a way to mark work is work and home is home, or other aspects is home. So for me, one of the ways that I developed that was, of course, when I'm at work, I have to wear a badge and it has a gazillion keys on it. But when I get in my car at the end of the day, the badge comes off and goes in my glove box and I close the door. And that's the signal to me to leave it there. We often fall into this trap because we have been sort of taught to believe that we are indispensable. And that's such a detrimental and unattainable expectation. The world is going to keep spinning if you are not answering your email. And so it becomes more about us understanding what is urgent versus taking in that everything is urgent. Okay? We want to encourage cooperation and collaboration rather than competition. When we are in competition with one another, that sets up that adversarial dynamic. You're looking for that more we, how do we the problem, and I need you to stop that. And then seeing people as whole people rather than abstractions. We as human beings absolutely love to make order out of chaos. We like things nice and orderly and in little boxes, except that people are so much more complex than that. And whenever we put somebody in a box, inevitably we feel disappointed when there is some aspect that they show us that doesn't fit the box. So if we allow for seeing a whole range of behaviors, then when somebody is showing us a challenging behavior, we don't associate that one behavior with who they are fundamentally. And that's really, really important. So we want to avoid blaming, right? And blame is one of the system's ways of showing you that they're traumatized, right? I will hear some staff who say, why are you, taking time off? You were just hit once. I've been hit and spit at 162 times. There's that competition. Who's hurt more? No, you're both hurt, right? And it's not about who's at fault, because many times it's not about fault at all. When we do blame, it doesn't allow for empathy, and it also doesn't let us have the cognitive flexibility to take in somebody else's perspective. You've got to respect your inner hero. This is when you don't get the parade that you've done everything great or the award, but there's this intrinsic feeling of well-being. And you have to model what you want people to see and behave as. It is very difficult if we tell our patients and our families to behave one way, and then they see us behaving in a different way entirely. You're sitting with a patient or a family and they're yelling at you, trying to say, set the limit that yelling right now is not going to be helpful, but then you turn around and yell at your staff member or your colleague, you're getting a very mixed message. That's ambiguity. That's a threat. We have to curb the inequalities, the inequities. And in the first one, I don't remember who it was, but they said, you know, I need to understand how not to be this sponge so that I don't get so depleted. And that's a skill. We want our boundaries to be what we refer to as semi-permeable, right? We can let certain things in and keep certain things out. If we let everything in, we get completely overwhelmed and keep everything out, we can't connect to the person's experience. So we have to practice. And the way we practice that is how we interact and set boundaries in our own lives. Remember, I was talking about that you're closer to your spouse than you are to your mail carrier. Well, that is telling you something about your boundaries. And so thinking about your boundaries in an interaction is an important part of doing the work. It isn't just about what is said in the therapy. It's about the structure you hang your therapy on. And so being extremely clear up front, who you are, what your role is, what you can deliver, what you can't, because the more you help people predict and expect, the less likely they will view you as a threat. And the more likely, as you say these things, they will become much more real to you, okay? Because if we don't, then we get burnout and compassion fatigue, right?
There's a question.
I'm
Deborah.
sorry.
There's a question from Harjinder. Would you like to respond?
Yes, let me see.
How do you deal with the situation when you're working with cooperation and collaboration, but the other person is strongly competitive?
Good point. It only takes one person in the dynamic to make the change. So if the person is competitive, but you don't engage in that competition, then that becomes a meaningless behavior. The driver, right, of that behavior is not going to get their needs met. So there then has to become on that end a change in tactic. Now that could be one of two things. They could try and reinforce the tactic and make it more competitive in the hopes that you will change your tactic and respond in kind, which will just set this dynamic in stone. What is hard is when somebody is competitive and you're being collaborative, and when they escalate, you stay here. And if you stay here, there is only so high they can go with that, because it's not going to meet their need. They're not going to get what they want out of that behavior. And so then it will come down. But oftentimes we find that escalation so difficult for us to sit with. We then step back into competitiveness. So it's a practice and it's hard. I am not going to say this is easy. It is very, very difficult and challenging to change that dynamic. So what I would say to the person who's trying to be collaborative and connected is to not only do it with that person, regardless of their escalating behavior, right? Because we know about reinforcement of behavior, but also to demonstrate that same response and connect with all the other people around in that way. Because then you get people who are upstanders. You get buy-in from those around you. And there's incredible power in that group dynamic. I hope that answers the question. I mean, that could be a whole training unto itself. All right. So we have antidotes. Great, we're like computers. There's an on-off switch, right? And so the off switch to fear, physiologically, is that stance of compassion. When we get a very angry presentation, what shuts that down is empathy. It's hard to be angry with somebody who understands that what you're saying is your truth and validates that experience. And then shame. Shame is often the result of much trauma and much violence. And when we say pride is the thing that changes that, we're talking about control and mastery and mattering, being seen and feeling heard, that fosters pride. So these are the literal antidotes to when you see in an escalation these presentations coming at you. And we're going to spend time in session four, actually breaking this down. What would this look like in an actual altercation? I do want to show you this other video about the ways in which these work to shut these things down, because what happens when we have the stance of compassion and kindness is that it's operating on the same biochemical receptors as fear, anger, and shame. It's absolutely remarkable. So hold on one second, and I will share this with you. So there's a little backstory to this. I have spent 10 years or so, more than that at this point, studying violence, writing about violence, understanding violence. And my daughter came home from high school one day and she said, Mom, I'm president of Kindness Club. And I went, say what? And she said to me, and every year we have this whole day and we bring in speakers and they talk about kindness and now she knows what I do for a living. And so I'm waiting and she says, and we have no budget. I'm like, okay, would you come in and talk to 1,600 high school students about kindness? And she said, and I want to be a biochemistry major. So can you find some way to talk about the biochemistry 1,600 auditorium? Okay, I said, yes, out of the mouths. And this is what I showed them. And as soon as I showed it to them, there was a piece that clicked in me that I hope will also click in you.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence
trying to get
is
rid of
grammatically correct.
The science of kindness, matter of fact. Like most medical antidepressants, kindness stimulates the production of serotonin. Serotonin heals your wounds, calms you down, and makes you happy. The real kicker? Kindness boosts serotonin in the giver, the receiver, and everyone who witnesses it. Every act of kindness also spreads through 3 degrees of separation, and serotonin is just the beginning. You'll also produce more endorphins, the brain's natural painkiller. Endorphins are 3 times more effective than morphine, and they won't land you in jail. And if that's still not quite enough, being kind produces oxytocin in your system. Oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, promotes social bonding, exerts an immediate calming effect, increases trust and generosity, strengthens the immune system, and boosts virility. I guess they weren't joking when they said being kind is a good thing. To top it all off, compassionate people also have 2 times the amount of DHEA, which slows down aging, and 23% less cortisol, the infamous stress hormone. With so many benefits, every act of kindness is a healthy one. It's a scientific fact.
So what we're doing when we practice compassion and kindness is literally changing another brain chemistry. You are changing it from that fight, flight, high stress cortisol, adrenaline into that ability to socially connect and to problem solve. And the good news is kindness costs us nothing. You know, we're talking about all of these really expensive interventions and systemic changes, and we can actually change brain chemistry if we alter the way we interact with people. So that's an amazing gift and can be unbelievably powerful. So that requires us then to have our own level of self-awareness and to check in and see if we ourselves are having any of these triggered responses. So if you have a day and you end your day and you are pissed off and really angry, you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. What was my part in this? What was their part in this? If you're in the, it's all their fault, the blame part, you need to check in and figure out what's going on there. If you're really, really angry, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid they're going to question your competence? Are you afraid for your physical safety? Are you afraid you don't know the answer? Are you afraid of time constraints? Because those are the things that are going to set you on a defensive path. Here's something really important. Is there anything that I did today that I wouldn't want my other coworkers or supervisors to know about? That's where we experience our own shame. Is there something that we did that we are embarrassed and ashamed of that we need to check in with ourselves about? This is why good supervision, trauma-informed supervision, is so incredibly vital when you do this work. And trauma-informed supervision is very different from an supervision. And then, what did you do today to make your own self feel proud? Right? Those things that make you happy, bring you joy. What did you do that makes you feel proud? Not, and I have to say this for people, sometimes they think of, well, I don't want to be arrogant or cocky. That's not what this is. This is, what did I do today that I took responsibility for and I feel good about having done? I feel good about myself for having done. And then, what did I do right? We are so often so busy saying what I did wrong. What did I do wrong? What didn't I finish? Where did I go astray? What did I do right? Because when you're looking at what you did right, you're more likely to do more of it. And you're also better able to see a balance. And those things where you have a conflict that doesn't escalate, that is what should get a parade, is those things that don't go. And we call those near misses. And we don't celebrate those enough. We need to celebrate those and explore them. Because ultimately, when we're talking about shame, we're talking about people's self-esteem and how they feel in the world. So people who feel invisible, who feel deprived, who feel that they've been treated unjustly, who feel that they have been disenfranchised or ignored, don't feel good about themselves and don't feel like others believe in them. So this concept of mattering goes hand in hand with the concept of pride. It is so important that we let people feel invisible become visible. That means that we listen, we invite them to share their opinions. If a patient and a family member come to you, take the time to hear the patient and the family's concerns before launching into what happens to be wrong with this lab result or test. There's a time where that being acknowledged and noticed is so important. Use the positive reinforcement to your advantage. Recognize the good skills that people are bringing to the table. You want people to do more of something, you acknowledge the thing that you want them to do more of. So if one of the things is, I'd like you to come more often, well, when they come, you acknowledge them. Thank you so much for being on time. They're more likely to do more of it. If you want to see the absence of behavior, like bullying or intimidation, reinforce the absence of that. So if somebody is constantly yelling to you, when they don't yell to you, you say, thank you so much for not yelling today. That way they feel seen and heard and visible. You always want to use people's names. If they have a title, be respectful of that. Ask them what pronouns they use. Make sure that they know that you see them. Because when they are being seen and they don't feel like an object or see you as an object, it becomes much more difficult to engage in some kind of negative behavior. That relationship has value, right? The relationship you build has to feel like it means something to that person. It can't just be your own agenda or your own design, right? And so people have to feel that they're important to some people, to themselves and to others. Trust is one of the biggest difficulties in escalations when there is basic mistrust. And we go back to Erickson's first basic stage, trust versus mistrust. When somebody is in fight, flight, or freeze, they are in ultimate mistrust. You have to take the time to activate that trust in your conversation again. And we're going to show you how to do that in additional sessions. And then you want that person to feel as if they matter, not only because they're receiving support from you, but because they have the capability to pay it forward and support others. So if you have a family member that is caring for a patient and the patient is yours, you need to acknowledge the family member is absolutely doing everything they possibly can, and that you are so grateful that they are helping this person get through it. Because when people feel like they have something to give someone else, they feel as if they exist and that they have a meaning and a purpose, and that is the antithesis of feeling shameful. And so when we put all of this together, and you're going to see this again, what we're seeing here is how the way we begin to communicate, where we are in the communication, what I think of me, what I think of you, right? And then where they're going to show you the challenging emotion. If you're having a conversation where you're both thinking of me, or I, there's fear involved in that, and there's ultimate mistrust. Your antidote, you've got to bring in that compassion. When you're thinking about somebody judging you, they're going to be angry because the judgment is either positive or negative. It's still a judgment. And they're suffering under the weight of that. That's when you need the empathy. And then when you have that ultimate judgment of, oh, you're not only judging me, but you're judging what I think of you too, there's a possibility for shame that is happening. Because not only am I feeling less than myself, you think I'm less than, and I know you think I'm less than. Compensatory response to make it right, you're going to get a very high level of escalation. And so to shut that off is that pride, to acknowledge that there are good things that they are doing, to acknowledge or be clearer about what you are thinking. So we're going to put all of this together, and by the end of the 5th session, you should be able to pick out where the presentation is and what tool you need to use in the right moment. Because empathy helps us separate us, and build those bridges of connection and compassion. And as I was saying, empathy can literally save your life. And so here we are at the end of our session, and I want to allow for questions or concerns, anything that is running through your head, anything that you would like more information about. Please, now is absolutely the time to ask. I'd be delighted.
So Deborah, it looks like a question about, will we be getting real life examples?
Absolutely, yes, you will. You will absolutely. When we start to pick apart escalations, we will use real life examples. If you come to that session and you have an example you would like us to pick apart, we can do it in real time. I'm happy to do that.
Thanks.
Yes, we are finding that those healing mechanisms that we knew evolutionarily, it's like lost knowledge, but it's all coming back. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, we'll make sure you get real life examples.
Yeah, feel free without the chat if you want to
Unmute. Sure.
add comments or say anything. You can unmute yourself and do it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you'll find the unmute button at the left corner at the bottom. Ms. Harjinder, if you wanted to say something.
Yes, hi, this is Harjinder
Hi.
here. Yes, Deborah, this is really, I can really relate to this because I have worked with some de-addiction rehabilitation centers, and where you do come across, you know, these anger, fear, and all these behaviors. And because I was very new with it, so I intimidated with it. And so that's why I have taken, I've like stepped out of it, because I felt that I'm not ready for it, because I don't know how to work with the aggression and all. So this is where I feel this one is really very apt and is really giving me a very good insight. Thank you for that. It's really
I'm
nice.
so happy. I love being able to share information that is useful and relevant, so that people do feel prepared to do the kind of work that they would like to do.
Yes, and this is where it's like where I do, when you are talking about the different, you know, the things that are involved in, and from both side parties, you know. So I do have some real life situations which were like which I dealt with and which I faced, and I would like to bring it up and see what differently could have been done. Of course, I know that I was not. You know, I kind of avoided it because I didn't know what to do in that situation. So this is where it keeps going back. What could have I done to handle it better? Yeah, so definitely, I really look forward.
I'm so glad. Bring them in. Bring them in. We will take a look at them, and you know, sort of dissect them piece by piece to break it down. Absolutely, great. I would love that. And anyone else is able to do it as well, for sure. Anyone else? We'll give you another minute. I do hope you enjoyed today's presentation and that you found it helpful and useful. If you did, please let us know. If you would like more information.
Yeah, absolutely. We really enjoyed the session, ma'am. There is something that I wanted to ask from you.
Please.
Is there a possibility? I know somebody who has been a victim of domestic violence.
Yeah.
Was unwilling to come on screen and talk about it. Is there a possibility if I can request her to join for the next session, and will we be able to help her in some way?
I think having any kind of knowledge that might help her feel more empowered would be great. Please feel free to invite her. That would be fine. But also recognize that what we're talking about is difficult, and Nancy will be here as well for additional support, but that what she may be hearing might also bring up some emotions for her. But if she's interested, by all means.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Yeah, if you do not have any more questions, I'd like to thank Deborah for the great presentation, and Nancy as well for your contribution and support here. I also would like to invite everyone for tomorrow's session, which will focus on assessment of violence and tools. I also take this opportunity to wish all of you a happy Ganesh Chaturthi for tomorrow, and celebrate those of you who do, and hope to see you all tomorrow. I will not be there tomorrow, but Nancy will be there.
Thanks, Kala.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nancy and Kala, how about if I send you another link and we can just touch base for a moment? Would that be okay?
Sure.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
All
Thank
have
you
a good
so
evening.
much.
See you soon.